by the rising of the moon, by the rising of the moon. For the pikes must be together at the rising of the moon. Oh, come tell me, Shannon Farrell, where the gathering is to be. In an old spot by the river, quite well known to you and me. One more word for signal token, whistle out the marching tune. Wear the pike upon your shoulder at the rising of the moon. At the rising of the moon, at the rising of the moon. Wear the pike upon your shoulder at the rising of the moon.
There had been an attempted landing at Bantry in December 1796 with a much larger force.
A fleet of up to 35 warships carrying anywhere from between 10 to 15,000 French troops.
Tone had succeeded in going to France, talking to the French Directory, which was something that he wasn't sure he'd be able to do, and coming away from that meeting with the news that the French were going to invade Ireland.
Under Admiral Hoche, and they set sail for Bantry Bay.
They had run into the greatest storm of the year, or even the decade.
The general ship was swept off course while he was evading the British Navy along the coast of Ireland. Meanwhile, the majority of his fleet actually got to Bantry Bay, including the ship in which Wolfe Tone was upon.
Wolfe Tone writes in his diary, I could throw a biscuit onto the shore at any time. At any time in these 5 days they could have landed. Why didn't they?
But the fleet itself is split in two. Unfortunately, what we describe as the command and control aspects of it become separated from the main body. Indeed, the ship on which all of the 7 French admirals were based sails off into the middle of the Atlantic and is lost. But worse than that, the general who is to lead the 14,000 strong army in Ireland, and he's one of the best generals the French have, he also sails into the Atlantic. And with that, it means that the army who make it to Bantry Bay are very, very limited in terms of their command and control structure.
Because of a man called Emmanuel de Grouchy. Because Hoche is not there yet, the second in command is Emmanuel de Grouchy, and he says, no, we must wait. They wait, the weather gets worse, and yes, the Protestant wind comes, and they have to set sail for home.
Now, his subordinates decided that they weren't going to disembark, they weren't going to get off their ship until their general arrived. But because of this delay, they were hit by a terrible storm that lasted a number of days, which left a lot of the ships damaged, a number of men drowned, but more importantly, they lost the element of surprise, and because of that, simply set sail back to France.
That would have placed an army of 14,000 of the best troops from the best army in Europe on the island right next door to England. It's one of those great times, you'd say, when the entire course of Irish history would have been changed.
Rumours persisted that a French invasion was imminent. HMS Kangaroo sent intelligence on the French fleet on 21st of December. Due to bad weather, news did not reach Downing Street until the 31st of December. The French had a 3-week start. Lord Castlereagh, the mask of anarchy. I met murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. Castlereagh led his exhausted troops through the snow to Bantry Bay, after many countermarches to meet the French army. He arrived to see the French turn sail for France. They had been unable to land due to the severe weather conditions. He wrote to his uncle Camden, "The weather has solved the problem and saved us the hazard." He was scathing about the general strategy, without any interruption from the weather. He believed the French would have taken Cork and found houses, provisions, clothing, money, and a safe harbour unmolested by the English.
Richard White, a landowner from the area, prepared local defences against the French. A grateful British administration created him Baron Bantry in 1797. He had sent out a small boat containing 10 men to find the intentions of the fleet. They were never seen again. He sent word to Cork about the invasion. He organised the Bantry Cavalry, whose banner still hangs in Bantry House's hall. He allowed the military free rein to his home. Although General Dalrymple arrived from Cork, the Irish winter weather had intervened and the French fleet was driven out of the bay on December 28th.
Worse than that, however, the wind blows fair for England and they can't reach the shore. One of the things they've had to do to weather the storms in France is get rid of a lot of the anchors, and they would have carried various different types of anchor. So they only have basic anchorage.
Bantry Bay failed epically. There was actually a minor scuffle between several French ships and British ships just off the coast of Cornwall.
And they were quite intent in helping the United Irishmen at this stage, albeit probably for their own purposes, because they themselves, the French, were still at war with England, and to have established a base here in Ireland to attack from the west would have been very much beneficial for them.
The French were trying to evaluate the purpose of landing in Ireland all the time.
From a French perspective, some troops, Marines, do actually land in Ireland and they move ashore and they meet the local people. But the French Marines return to the ships and say, okay, well, the Irish are being very nice and they're very friendly. However, we don't see anything in the Irish character which tells us that they're ready to join with us and spark off their own revolution.
'Tis better far to die when nature cries and famine stares you in the face. 'Tis time to rise, or else despise the rights of man.
Wolfe Tone is down but not out. He's back in France and he has to make more plans. But meanwhile, things are kicking off in Ireland.
The French were disheartened. In contrast, the United Irishmen did not see the French failure in the same way. They believed the French would come again.
Lord Edward Fitzgerald, the most fascinating man, in my opinion, in the entire rebellion. His brother was the richest man in Ireland, the Duke of Leinster. Their family home is Carton House. Their castle is Kilkee Castle. Their city house was Leinster House.
January 1797, Lord Edward wrote, "Every day the violent measures of the Irish tyrants increase."
So, how was Edward Fitzgerald involved in 1798?
Well, he was a member of the United Irishmen. He was actually their military organiser. He had become politicised before he went to France, and he was influenced by the French Revolution. He'd met Thomas Paine, and he himself had been a member of Parliament. So he's not coming from a typical revolutionary background, but while he's in France, he is politicised like so many. men at that time, comes back and joins the United Irishmen.
1797 is an appalling year in Ireland. Effectively what happens is they are so scared by the French invasion that the redcoats, I'll now call them the government troops, or the redcoats from here on in. There's many different names for them, the loyal militia, the yeomen, all of these things, but they all come under the banner of redcoats. The government, the British Army really, but it's the government. They go crazy. They go around the country instilling terror.
The 1796 invasion, or the almost landing of the French army in Bantry Bay, really sets tremors through Ireland and England, and it puts a terror on both kingdoms.
The yeomen and militia are out of hand, but the worse they get, the more angry young men we recruit. We even have our own men joining the militia to provide us with arms and information. If he can get here by the end of this year, or early 97, the English won't be able to contain things here without losing ground in the Continental War.
Arthur O'Connor was arrested and charged with high treason for writing an inflammatory address to the free electors of the county of Antrim. He was confined in Dublin Castle. O'Connor and Lord Edward were the north-south axis of the United movement. February 1797. Edward Lewins was sent to Hamburg to urge the French to return quickly.
Castlereagh was named in the Northern Star newspaper as one who betrays his friends and insults his benefactors. Thomas Pelham, Camden's chief secretary, had been taken ill. Castlereagh's uncle, Camden, had Castlereagh fill the position temporarily. Camden was losing control, and Castlereagh's local knowledge was invaluable. The young man relied on the wily, cynical civil servant Edward Cook, who took a satanic pleasure in the art of political intrigue. Robert and William Sims of the Northern Star were arrested.
What came out of Bantry Bay was possibly the worst paranoia this country ever experienced.
The squalid network of paid informers also grew. The severity of the magistrates and the fears of the landowners increased. Francis Higgins, the sham squire and proprietor of the government newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, was a clever spy master. Leonard McNally, a barrister who had defended some United Irishmen in court, betrayed others to Dublin Castle. Samuel Turner, a trusted Belfast committee member, had turned government spy. Samuel Sproul, a landowner who had been part of the United Irishmen, turned informer to counteract these hellish plots.
I am, do you see, an informer, sir, as horrid a dog as any. At the sessions house and the castle yard, swore false for many a guinea. None can convenient memory boast more than ingenious eye. Not even my employer, sir, who has hired me for a spy. With conscience light and free from spite, it is my only care that the cause be right or wrong. This is the burden of my song, for money I can swear.
13th of March 1797. General Gerard Lake issued an order that all arms were to be surrendered in Ulster.
Lake wrote to the Home Secretary in London, I cannot help wishing that we had full powers to destroy their homes or to try some of them by law if they did not bring in their arms. Terror will keep them in order. General Gerard Lake served in America during the War of Independence. He was Lieutenant Colonel under Cornwallis and was taken prisoner at Yorktown.
The military terrorised Belfast. Camden admitted its purpose was to strike terror into the rebels. Lord Londonderry, Castlereagh's grandfather, had his home put under armed guard. Not a penny in rent was paid to him by his tenants. Hostile handbills were signed by his tenants and widely circulated. The question was not now if, but when the United Irishmen would rebel.
Charles Bateson, in his book The Convict Ships, relates that the combination of a callous and brutal master and a weak, incompetent surgeon made the voyage of the first Britannia one of the worst in the history of transportation. The convicts were brutally mistreated. And in March 1797, the maltreated United Irish prisoners mutinied on board Captain Thomas Dennett's convict ship Britannia off the coast of South America. 11 died after receiving 300 to 700 lashes each. Even the women received 3 or 4 dozen cuts from a cane for trivial offences. According to the Historical Records of Australia, Series 1, Volume 11, Jenny Blake, a convict, was gagged and had her hair cut, beaten with a cane over her back, shoulders and face, and afterwards placed in irons with both legs and chained with a chain. Dennett was held in Sydney, and word was sent to England about his callous and brutal treatment of the convicts. The only repercussion was he never served on a convict ship again.
Today for the Kildare Militia. Every man over the age of 17 was liable for conscription into the Kildare Militia.
Now, the establishment, I suppose, they were a little bit frightened that the rank and file of the militias were predominantly Catholics. So in 1795 they then established the yeomanry. The yeomanry itself was meant to be exclusively a Protestant force, but a lot of the times they were charged, particularly here in County Wexford, they charged local landlords to establish their yeomanry corps. And what the landlords would do, they would go to their tenants, who again a lot of them would have been Catholics, to fill the ranks of the yeomanry corps. And then again that was when you'd have the United Irishmen infiltrating the ranks of the both militia and the yeomanry at the time.
The yeomanry were kind of a localised military force established in September 1796. And basically what happened was, when war with France started, the army, which was garrisoned in Ireland full time, had to go abroad to fight the French army in Spain, Portugal, in India and so on.
There was 18,000 militia in Ireland. There was also this new yeomanry force that had been established in September 1796.
This is the type of uniform which would have been worn by the infamous Ancient Britons. Now, the Ancient Britons were a fencible regiment from Wales who were a mounted unit, and they came over to Ireland around about 1797, and they were initially used in the White Terror in Ulster. They put down the Presbyterian United Irishmen. They carried out very many, some would say atrocities, but they basically imposed order and discipline, as they would have seen it in military terms, on the rebels.
And the total Crown Force numbers in Ireland at that stage was about 50,000. Yeomanry, which was actually predominantly Catholic at that time.
There was a need to garrison the country, and also a need to, if you like, have a more allow the militias, which was a more regular military force, to be able to move with action or to actually fight in Ireland. So they needed somebody to do the basic day-to-day duties of looking after the barracks, going out on patrols and so on. So they were armed with muskets. They did have some cannon, and they had a small cavalry force. They were officered by a local gentry who got their commissions in October 1796 by the local gentry, and it was usually their estate tenants who joined.
This is a standard pattern British or militia bayonet of the same time as 1798. It's something that would stay current all the way through till around about 1860, 1870 in the American War of Independence. It's a particularly vicious weapon, although it might not necessarily look at first glance, because it has a triangular profile. And what it's actually designed to do is to inflict wounds which can't be easily stitched. When that's driven into a body, it'll produce a triangular sucking wound that a barber surgeon or somebody who's treating a wounded man on the field won't be able to easily stitch. And the reason for that is the economics of war don't necessarily change. Sometimes it's better to injure your enemy than to actually kill them, because the enemy combatant will then need 2 or 3 other people to remove them from the battlefield. And this is a yeoman sword. It's an antique. It's about the same time. It's actually a Marmaluke sword, and that's the blade of the sword that would have been used. Now, this particular weapon would have been issued to the yeoman cavalry and yeoman infantry, and as you can see, it's not a particularly long blade, but it's a curved blade, and the blade is designed so from horseback that can be hooked down into an opponent, and then it naturally is drawn back as a cavalryman goes by. So that's why the actual curve comes through it. The groove which is in the blade isn't designed so that blood runs cleanly down it. It's designed so that when it's passed into the body, it is pulled more easily back out of the body, because it doesn't create a vacuum around itself. So every part of it has been designed with some purpose in mind, and then that goes into the scabbard. So you would have had the infantry equipped with the bayonet, and then you would have had the mounted men and the officers equipped with swords like this.
I suppose until that stage, the establishment at the time didn't quite realise how much of a serious threat the United Irishmen posed. So what they did immediately after the failed French landing was to dispatch their local yeomen and militia forces. These were a part-time kind of force of soldiers or militias, if you will, here in Ireland, and they were sent across the countryside throughout 1797 and in the spring of 1798 with orders to infiltrate the ranks of the United Irishmen, arrest their leaders, find out their plans, effectively anything at all that they could do to break up the movement.
The Orangemen were sort of allowed to do whatever they wanted. General Lake actually encouraged that. He encouraged whatever means necessary to quash the United Irishmen or the defenders. There was no quarter given. The Orangemen were known for attacking innocent families at their houses. Sometimes warnings were given. No papists around this place. They reckon several hundred to maybe several thousand Catholics from Eastern Tyrone, Armagh, actually fled into Mayo, Leitrim, Longford, and even some down to Wicklow.
That's when the kind of tortures then came in.
And there's frequent references made, even by members of their own officers, to the terror that they imposed. And indeed, one officer says that during the whole time he was with the ancient Britons, although he heard many shots fired, he never heard shots fired by anyone else but them.
Where there were people flogged in the streets, and it was not only the punishments were not only intended to punish the individuals, but they were intended to terrify the population and at large. The British Castlereagh and the British leadership, they were cognizant that the rebellion was about to break out. So they decided to cut the head off the monster, as Castlereagh himself said, by taking out the leadership of Belfast. And they went and they took 12. They brought down 12 of the leaders in carriages, 12 separate carriages, and brought them from Belfast to Dublin for incarceration. Some of them went to Newgate, and some were put into the new prison of Kilmainham. It was called the county jail.
Castlereagh, William Pitt's henchman, manipulated everything through spies and informers who riddled every town. He sat at his desk in Dublin Castle, and his informers informed on each other. The screams of the peasants flogged at the triangle in view of the castle windows were a fitting accompaniment to Castlereagh's song of death inside the secretary's office, according to Francis Joseph Biggar of the Northern Leaders of 98.
Attacks started to get more sporadic. Houses were burned, people were being killed, and then General Lake was sent into Ulster to bleed it white of United Irishmen and nationalism of any sort. And certain groups like the Ancient Britons, also famous for their escapades in County Wexford later in 1798, were given the free will to go whatever they wanted with their sabres, and to hack and to kill and to hang and to rape and to pillage wherever they wanted. It's one of the main reasons why the likes of County Tyrone and Armagh didn't rise. Just seen it had seen its own terror. It was brutal tactics used by General Lake, known as the dragooning of Ulster. There's the famous accounts of the song "The Wearing of the Green" sort of highlights all that. You know, the wearing of the green for the hanging men and women for the wearing of the green. There was the one famous story that was highlighted where a woman was wearing her green dress, and that the soldiers upturned the dress and prodded her with bayonets. And
here we have examples of Irish militia. Now, the important thing to remember about the Irish militia, they were assembled in 1793, and the government wasn't entirely happy with the idea, because they were thinking back to the last time they had engaged with Irish volunteers and being forced to make political concessions. When the militia are assembled, it is because they want to use Catholic manpower, and the important thing that brings in, it begins to remilitarize Catholic Ireland. Men who join the militia will learn how to use weapons and will learn how to fight in organised groups. Now, they're a very efficient force. They're a militia, albeit a Catholic militia, but they are led by and large, Protestant officers.
So, were these militia within their own county, or were they posted elsewhere?
Officially, they could serve within their own county when the Act was formed, but in realism, they all served away from their own counties and were shifted every 6 to 12 months.
Any display of being any way nationalist was crushed, immediately crushed. We're starting to crack down on the United Irish elements within their ranks, such as what happened at Blair's camp outside Belfast, where they executed several of their soldiers because of their political leanings.
70 of Colonel Leslie's Monaghan militia declared themselves United Irishmen in Belfast. Leslie, an implacable enemy of Catholics, promised a pardon for those who admitted their part. The ringleaders, Peter Carron, Daniel Gillen, and the brothers William and Owen McKenna, were shot by firing squad as they knelt on their coffins. Their bodies were buried in an unmarked grave just inside the entrance gate at Blair's old graveyard. Before that, the troops were marched past in a grim warning of the penalty for rebellion. After their executions, ballads telling of their heroism were passed out under smocks and great coats on the streets of Belfast. Government executions brought revulsion and new recruits.
At the time, there was worries whether the Catholic militia would fight for the government, for this Protestant government in College Green. They do prove astonishingly loyal, and although some of them do desert and move over, as did Yeoman and others, the militia stay and they fight for the government. And many of the atrocities, and it is important to remember, many of the atrocities which are carried out by Catholic militiamen against Catholic rebels.
The Monaghan militia, anxious to prove their loyalty, wrecked the office of the Northern Star, newspaper of the Society of United Irishmen. They destroyed both offices and the press. This resulted in the demise of the newspaper, much to the satisfaction of the authorities.
It was hardly surprising that the government should move against the United Irishmen.
A quote we could use regarding the dragooning, a great description, it was actually by a trooper known as John Gifford of the Ancient Britons. While stationed at Newry in County Down, he was quoted for saying, "I was directed by the smoke and the flames of burning houses, and by the dead bodies of boys and old men slain by the Britons. Though no opposition whatever had been given by them, and as I shall answer to Almighty God, I believe a single gun was not fired but by the Britons or yeomanry. I declare there was nothing to fire at. Old men, women and children expected. From 10 to 20 were killed outright, many wounded, and 8 houses burned." The defenders were well supported throughout Ireland, but because they'd been assimilated with the United Irishmen, with the plans of rebellion and with French support, they were in a sense tamed by the United Irish leadership. So reprisals against Orange attacks were not as common.
Lord Edward went to London to urge for French help from Jagerhorn, the French agent there. He was worried about splits in the United Irish movement. However, Hoche was embroiled in rivalry with Napoleon, and the French were longing for peace.
The British military burned houses, tortured many, as well as killed guilty and innocent. Picketing was used, where a man was hung by one arm with a pointed stake underneath his feet. He would have to rest his feet, effectively torturing himself. Flogging was also used on suspected United Irishmen and civilians to inform on others. They were often tied to a tree, stripped and flogged mercilessly.
So flogging effectively is the same as whipping.
Yeah.
The person will be lashed a number of times until they give in to their captor's wishes. But just to note, the Crown forces at the time would have employed this with their own troops. Their own foot soldiers who didn't obey orders would have been also flogged for their punishments.
Wolfe Tone had reservations about the French help. He was afraid about the amount of control the French or their allies would take of Ireland. He was concerned about Bonaparte's proclamation in Genoa, Italy. General Hoche reassured Tone, "Bonaparte has been my scholar, but he shall never be my master." Wolfe Tone felt Bonaparte was jealous of General Hoche.
The United Irishmen and the French would have been on the same lines religiously, if you want to put it like that. I don't think they really gave a damn what you were, to be perfectly honest.
Okay.
You know, that was the whole ethos of the United Irishmen, Catholic, Protestant, dissenter. But the French had, I don't know what you want to call it, orders, shall we say, or there was orders issued that whoever was put in charge in Ireland was not to be of any zealous religious persuasion.
Yeah.
and that's to make sure of that. So whoever took Ireland, be it Humbert or Hoche or whoever it was, that they were to remain in charge until they found somebody suitable to take over, who wasn't a bigot or sectarian.
During the anti-clericalism of the French Revolution, monasteries and convents were suppressed, and some priests and nuns were guillotined. The Irish Catholic Church was taking note. Wolfe Tone was involved in another invasion at the North Sea port of Texel at the Netherlands. 15 sail of the line were ready, along with 10 frigates and sloops. 27 transports are ready for a wind to bring them to Ireland. Once again, the weather saved England with the wind blowing in the wrong direction. The British fleet had been distracted by mutinies at the Nore and at Spithead. Unfortunately, the Dutch hadn't been ready. Wolfe Tone has said, 18 days aboard and we have not had 18 minutes of favourable wind. Messages had arrived to Wolfe Tone at the end of July that Ulster was losing confidence in the United Irishmen, with General Lake's ability to disarm them.
Sectarian attacks. Many hundreds of Catholics fled Armagh and Tyrone. The Catholic defenders were no match for the Orangemen, whose attacks on Catholic cottages were allowed by General Lake and the hardliners in Dublin Castle. Interestingly, on July the 12th, 1797, as Orangemen were celebrating the Battle of the Boyne, the Kerry Militia attacked them with bayonets, resulting in 14 dead.
Now there was a unit of Kerry Militia were stationed within the village.
Lord Blaney's dragoons attacked the Kerry Militia and killed 3.
Whatever happened anyway, it led to a serious brawl in which Sergeant Mahoney and 5 or 6 of his privates were killed.
In a letter to Henry Joy McCracken, who was at that time imprisoned in Kilmainham jail, it stated that a militiaman was in the act of giving money to a slain yeoman's children when he was stabbed by the horsemen, but the Kerry Militia were blamed for religious agitation.
The Orangemen were given their free will to do whatever they wanted.
Lord Edward missed his old friend. O'Connor still languished in jail. In August, O'Connor was let out on bail, probably put up by Lord Edward. He, Lord Edward, and Valentine Lawless started a new newspaper, The Press, to replace the defunct Northern Star. But Leonard McNally, the government spy, infiltrated it by becoming a shareholder and supplied evidence to compile a damning dossier on Lord Edward.
Another serious blow was that General Hoche had suddenly died of consumption.
October 1797. The turncoat Samuel Turner presented Lord Edward as a firebrand, ready to lead a rising without the French. He sent a letter he had stolen from Jagerhorn to Dublin Castle to incriminate Lord Edward.
And then the executions begin. William Orr, a Presbyterian, is the first to be executed in the north, a Northern Presbyterian.
Why was "Remember Orr" the rallying cry of the United Irishmen? William Orr, from a Presbyterian farming family in Farranshane, Antrim, cut a splendid figure, 6'2", well dressed, wearing a green necktie. He wrote for the Northern Star. He was charged with administering the United Irish Oath to a serving soldier, Hugh Wheatley. This was deemed treasonable. The only evidence was the unsupported report of Wheatley. But the United Irishmen and the eyewitness James Jamie Hope knew this to be false. It was actually administered by William McKeever, who subsequently escaped to America. Orr made an impassioned speech from the dock. My friends and fellow countrymen, in the 31st year of my life, I have been sentenced to die upon the gallows. The judge who condemned me humanely shed tears in uttering my sentence. But that informer was forsworn. To the generous protection of my country, I leave a beloved wife and 5 living children who have been my delight. May they love their country as I have done, and die for it, if needful. Later, the witness Wheatley went insane and committed suicide. The Viceroy, Lord Camden, was deaf to all appeals. The population of the town expressed their sympathy with the patriot murdered by law by quitting the town on the day of his execution. Orr was hanged in Carrickfergus on the 14th of October 1797. Orr is the first United Irish martyr. A huge funeral procession, which was illegal, accompanied the coffin. The local yeomanry, unable to prevent the procession due to the sheer weight of the mourners' numbers, harassed the mourners on their journey. The yeomanry surrounded the graveyard at his interment, and they goaded the mourners by braying like donkeys and flaunting a banner bearing the words Éireann go Bray, B-R-A-Y. In 1998, 201 years after his murder, his grave was finally marked by the local Presbyterian community. The law forbade any marker on his grave as a convicted felon. It remained unmarked for 200 years.
Remember Orr was found written on walls and pavements. It was even cut on pike handles. On the bicentennial of 98, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in Trinity College, Dublin, the visiting scholars stated, "Remember Orr." 17th of October 1797. Castlereagh wrote to Prime Minister Pitt to inform him that his absence from Parliament was due to the challenges in the north, which remained formidable. Another blow struck Tone's mission, with the Dutch fleet being completely defeated by British naval superiority at the Battle of Camperdown.
November 1797. Lord Edward recruited the flamboyant 26-year-old Thomas Reynolds, whose father, a wealthy silk merchant, had lost his fortune due to the importation of cotton. He leased Kilkee Castle from the Duke of Leinster. Lord Edward had made a serious mistake. The young man was not to be trusted.
In 1797 and early 1798, a lot of arms raids upon Loyalist houses. In one instance, in November 1797, the defenders in South County Wicklow attacked a Loyalist, an aged Loyalist man. He was known to have been an inoffensive old man. His name was Richard Nixon, and upon calling to his door to see a crowd of people at his door, he asked, what do you want? It was recorded that he was partially deaf, and he kept going out to try and talk with this gathering outside his house, and they stabbed him to death with their pikes on his doorstep. Martial law was declared in Wicklow not long after. He was a man about 80 years of age, like I said, inoffensive, and even the local Catholic clergy spoke out against the defenders.
2nd of December 1797. Lord Camden wrote to the Home Secretary in London about the intelligence he had which could bring certain people forward, and he could make a salutary impression on the minds of the people. Lord Edward was tailed in the street. His circle of confidants had now shrunk to Pamela, Arthur O'Connor and a few United Irishmen. Untrue reports came into the castle that O'Connor and Lord Edward were trying to inspire an immediate revolution and a French invasion by spreading rumours among Catholics that the Protestant Orangemen were going to attack their chapels as they assembled for Christmas Mass. But Ireland's rulers, with few exceptions like Lord Edward, remained loyal to London. O'Connor argued with Lord Edward for decisive action. He lost the dispute and left the country in December 1797. Lord Edward was now alone, about to turn into the leader he had never thought he would be.
Wolfe Tone met Napoleon for the first time. Napoleon's knowledge of Ireland wasn't very good. He had presumed Ireland's population was only 2 million and not 4 million.
O vanished hope, O transient boast, O country gained but to be lost.
What news?
The news is poor. General Lake has put Ulster to the sword. French fleet failed to land in Bantry and Tone sailed back to France. However, Lord Edward tells me he's talked to the French before and he thinks they'll try again.
Lord Edward? You mean Fitzgerald?
I knew you'd be pleased.
The man's almost a prince. If he's with us, he could impossibly be against us.
Ulster may be quiet now, with you and the others in jail, but the news that the French tried to land has cheered the people no end.
Oh, the French are on the sea, says the Shan Van Vogt. Oh, the French are on the sea, says the Shan Van Vogt. Oh, the French are in the bay, they'll be here without delay. And the orange will decay, says the Shan Van Vogt. And the orange will decay, says the Shan Van Vogt. And their camp it will beware, says the Shan Van Vogt. Oh, their camp it will beware, says the Shan Van Vogt. On the Curragh of Kildare, and the boys will all be there, with their pikes in good repair, says the Shan Van Vogt. With their pikes in good repair, says the Shan Van Vogt.
Napoleon Bonaparte told Wolfe Tone personally that he was appointed as Adjutant General to the Army of England. Wolfe Tone was starting to see some hope. France's military power had dominated Europe at the time.
9th of January 1798. General Sir Ralph Abercrombie, commander of British forces in Ireland, admitted Ireland was in a state of licentiousness.
Well, we're here in Collins Barracks. It's the largest purpose-built barracks in Europe. And in 1798, Britain, which is now at war with revolutionary France, needs to find an accommodation with Catholic Ireland. 20% of the British Army and Navy are made up of Irish, both Catholic and Protestant. And what Britain needs to do is to turn the population of Ireland into a manpower reserve to wage war against France. And those troops are going to be trained here in Collins Barracks and in other barracks around Ireland. But this is where the bulk of them are going to come through. Okay. The British Army is transformed by the Revolutionary War, and the Irish are going to play a major part in that.
This is a reproduction of the Sergeant Major of the City of Dublin Militia, 1798. Okay. You can see he's got the blue. Yeah. That's the helmet that they wore, standard to all enlisted ranks.
Okay.
In the regiment.
Okay, that's great. And do you want to just tell me about the sword?
The sword is very simple. It's just the NCO sidearm or spittoon, and it's really a jabbing sword.
Yeah, yeah.
As you can see, this is an original 1796 pattern light dragoon sword or sabre, and it's designed to slash from horseback downward. The weight is all at the front, and it carries the top. So it's designed to slash, cut.
And you said that's from 1796, is it?
This sword was made in 1790. It's a 1796 pattern. This sword is actually made by Gill of London, who was one of the major sword makers of this at the time. This is an original.
General Sir John Moore described many areas being given free quarters in the search for arms. This meant to let loose the military, who were encouraged in great acts of violence.
You've got to look at the construction of the army here at the time, which was the Irish establishment or the Irish army, as opposed to the British army or the English army, which was in England. The Irish army here was under the Lord Lieutenant, based in what was now called Phoenix Park. So there was the regular soldier, there was the militia, there was the yeoman, and there were fencible or volunteer units. All were employed during this period of time.
The complexity of a British commander in Ireland is having to work with the Loyalists, having to work with the Irish government in situ, while at the same time satisfying the army, while at the same time satisfying his London masters.
Oh, I see.
So it's a very complex situation. Basically, the strategy, the military commander in Ireland was a Scot called General Abercrombie, and he had been educated partially by Jacobin influenced teachers. So he was very sympathetic to the American revolutionaries, never mind Irish revolutionaries. And he had a reasonable sympathy with Irish people. You tend to find Cornwallis as well.
Okay.
I think the level of poverty of the ordinary people really shocked them.
Okay.
And the indifference of the ruling elites and classes. Camden basically is in conflict with the Irish gentry, who are running the parliament here, and his own superiors in London. And the Irish gentry have a back channel to London, so they're undermining him constantly. They see him as vacillating, they see him as indecisive, they see him as not understanding the full fears. And to understand that, you have to understand the Cromwellian uprising, the slaughter of settlers before Cromwell came here for revenge. Those legacies really kind of were still with the Protestant classes in Ireland. So there was a terrible fear and a folk memory of that. Plus you have the White Boys, the Defenders, you have all of these groups who are undermining what they see as the rule of law.
But the Northern delegation were very, very anxious to go ahead with the rebellion because they had suffered the tortures and cruelties over a period of 2 years, from 96 to 98, and they were in desperate straits and they were anxious to get going.
A lot of a band was keeping it all together in Dublin. He was having the director meetings in his house.
We are on the threshold of an historic moment. For the first time in almost 600 years, we have the opportunity to free this country and its people.
Most of the militia are Catholic who will happily come over to our side bringing their weapons with them. The yeomen may be trained. We cannot be defended from our goal. We must strike.
Yes, you're right. We must be quick. We still have the element of surprise on our side, but let's not be foolish if we can avoid it. How soon can you get word from France?
The decision was made. Lord Edward Fitzgerald presided over this this convention, and they decided, because there were some delegates who were anxious to wait for French support.
But because he had his training in the British Army, he is the perfect man to be their chief military organiser. And he's one that is so on for rebellion. He's urging an immediate rebellion in the early part of 1798.
And the discussion about when the French would arrive was prominent at this convention. Whereas Henry Joy was the leading speaker from the north, and he did not want to wait for the French.
Sure.
They wanted to go ahead with the rebellion because of the suffering of the people in the north. They needed redress immediately. So the vote was taken, and they decided to postpone it for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And the result of that was the word got out to Dublin Castle, which was only within 100 yards or a couple of 100 yards of where the actual convention took place.
Okay.
And they knew it was on. The Dublin Castle knew that the rebellion was on, and they immediately went out and arrested the entire Leinster Directory and lodged them in Kilmainham jail.
Once Ulster began to lose confidence in the United Irishmen, it started to really get organised elsewhere, more than likely out of desperation. The United Irishmen started to align themselves more with the agrarian defenders organisations around the country.
What we're trying to do is to get Catholic defenders and Protestant People Day boys to stop bothering each other and join together to work for a better future for all of them.
We need you to help carry arms and information about the country. There are very few we can trust. The more organised we are, the better our chances of getting help from France.
A third French expedition to Ireland was being prepared. The Dublin National Directory were spreading news of the Orange Terror in Ulster. Some of these stories were embellished for propaganda, such as the Protestants wanted to massacre all the Catholics in Ireland.
In early 1798, because of the paranoia of the infiltration within the militia and the yeomanry, a test oath was created where all the soldiers were requested to swear an oath of allegiance to King George and to the government. And in one occasion, in early 1798, the yeomanry of Ballyelis under Jarvis White completely fell apart because the majority of the yeomanry refused to take the oath, so that in a sense they mutinied. In Ballyelis, just outside Carnew and County Wicklow, just on the border of Wexford. The Castletown yeomanry, there was mass resignations as well because people refused to take this oath. Billy Byrne, the famous Wicklow leader, he refused to take the oath with the Wicklow cavalry. So in a sense they became marked men. You didn't have to have your head cropped to become marked men in that sense. The hardcore elements of the yeomanry, which at that stage was being replaced, the hardcore elements within the yeomanry were Orangemen, magistrates that were Orange in Wexford. An example would be Hunter Gowan or Hawtrey White, and all across Ireland this was happening. A lot of the magistrates were starting to crack down upon this seepage within the ranks of Green nationalism.
26th of February 1798, Abercrombie issued a general order criticising the lack of discipline in the army.
So in 1797, late 1797 and early 1798, there was a major increase in attacking Loyalist farmhouses in order to procure weapons.
Colonel Richard St. George Mansra and Magistrate Jasper Uniacke, with an escort of 2 soldiers, called to his Arraglen estate to scold his tenantry for their insurrectionary spirit and for felling his trees for pike handles. St. George was wearing a black silk scarf to conceal a severe American war head wound. He threatened to burn more houses and transport every United Irishman he could discover amongst them.
James Regan, hooray! You are found guilty of treason, swearing of the rebels into the United Irishmen and forging of pipes.
Captain Doe's men killed both gentlemen after dark and wounded Mrs. Uniacke by throwing her downstairs. She survived and identified two of the assailants, John Hay and Timothy Hickey, at their trial later in 1798. Both men were found guilty and executed at Arraghlin.
Instances like that were becoming quite common across Ireland in the spring of 1798, which further encouraged retaliation from the Crown forces, which just led into a whirlwind of paranoia.
However, they all set a date of March the 12th to meet up in Oliver Bond's house. Oliver Bond, again, a Presbyterian businessman who lives in Thomas Street. They all meet up at his house and they are all captured, except for two people. Why were the entire leadership of the United Irishmen captured? Because of a man who was in their confidence called Thomas Reynolds. Thomas Reynolds was a tenant and friend of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, a silk merchant. But the British paid him so much money to give up the United Irishmen that he could not refuse. The money at the time was £5,000 and £1,000 a year for the rest of his life. In today's money, that's a down payment of €400,000 and 80,000 a year for the rest of your life.
The problem with all the secret societies at the time and after in Ireland, you had a huge problem with informers. And the Council of the United Irishmen were meeting in Oliver Bond's house, not too far from here on Bridge Street, and there was a sweep and they were arrested. And Edward Fitzgerald had been fortunate that he was not present at the meeting.
But who escapes? Lord Edward Fitzgerald. He's not at the meeting, he gets away. The second person that gets away is the United Irish leader from Wexford.
The United Irish delegates arrested at Oliver Bond's were Peter Ivers, Lawrence Kelly, George Cummins, John Lynch, Lawrence Griffin, Thomas Reynolds, John McCann, who was executed on the 28th of July, Patrick Devine, Thomas Traynor, William Michael Byrne, who was hanged on the 19th of July, Christopher Martin, Peter Bannon, James Rose, and Edward Hudson. Oliver Bond was brought to trial for high treason on the 23rd and 24th of July. After a deliberation of 7 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence was read to Oliver Bond. You, Oliver Bond, are to be taken from the place in which you stand to the jail from whence you came, and thence to the common place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck, but not until you are dead, for while you are yet living, your bowels are to be taken out and thrown in your face, and your head is to be cut off, and your head and limbs to be at the king's disposal. Bond subsequently received a conditional pardon, but died of an apoplectic attack in Newgate prison. One of the people who was late to attend was the Wexford delegate Robert Graham of Corkcannon. He had a dalliance with a barmaid at the Bleeding Horse in Camden Street, which caused him to arrive late at the meeting and therefore avoided arrest. As a result of this, no figure for United Irish recruitment in Wexford came into government hands. This allowed for complacency about the county. There was still hope around the country. The most wanted and most dangerous man in Ireland, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, was still on the loose. What will happen next?